Conversation is former CDC senior advisor Loretta Lepore. Loretta, thank you
Hi.
so much for joining us on this Friday. Let's dive right into it because the hearing got a lot of attention, got a lot of
Mhm.
publicity, made for a lot of viral moments, and yet, as we mentioned, not all that much of substance was said. So, what were some of your main takeaways?
There was a lot to unpack there. And good morning. Thank you for having me. I should start out with that. But in any event, I think there was a lot to unpack there. For me personally, it brought back a lot of the feelings associated with that particular point in time, the gravity of the situation, the responsibility, the accountability to the American public, and the complexity of dealing with a real time pandemic. I think the hearing itself, now that we've had a couple of days to step away from the sort of dynamic nature of that hearing, we're able to kind of process through a little bit more. It's clear that there are deep-seated feelings amongst the general public, clearly amongst members of Congress, about how things within the response were handled, why people's lives were impacted to the degree that they were. People lost loved ones during that time. They lost livelihoods. It was, the seriousness of the time all came rushing back. And then we had also, the general tenor and optics of what was happening in the room and Dr. Fauci's decision to take the fifth, which has left people with sort of a bad taste. And you combine that with the release of the diaries, and there's a lot of conflict and I think disappointment amongst those who worked with him so closely.
So, one of those people who worked closely with him was you. You worked alongside him during the pandemic. What did you make of, or let me back up, did you see any conflict between his public statements and what was in the diary from what you've read?
So my experience with Dr. Fauci, I met Dr. Fauci before the pandemic. When I first joined CDC, he and Dr. Redfield were two of the primary principals leading and ending the HIV initiative on behalf of the first Trump administration. And Dr. Redfield and Dr. Fauci would travel quite a bit together. They would present together quite a bit. I found Dr. Fauci to be incredibly graceful in his interactions with me. It was always a profound experience to be with Dr. Redfield and Dr. Fauci because those individuals who were attending those events, you could see the admiration for their long-standing work in the field of HIV, the difference they had made directly in people's lives as clinicians and doctors, and then the research they'd brought about to help people living with HIV live a near normal lifetime. And so going into COVID, the situation changed quite a bit. People were working remotely. My responsibilities were directly related to Dr. Redfield and his responsibilities within the response and CDC's responsibilities. Wasn't in the presence of Dr. Fauci all that often during the response. And most of the doctors were spending a great deal of time in the White House as part of the coronavirus task force, working day in and day out. And so I wasn't with him on a daily basis to be able to see or hear some of the things that were conveyed in his diary. But I do know that Dr. Fauci was very willing, very accessible, throughout his career to the media in particular, and he was a very reliable, accessible source for them with regard to information. So I understood his commentary and his diary about that piece. He also had very significant relationships with members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and they leaned on him um, often for expertise. I think some of the things that came to light regarding the response itself and his thoughts and opinions may have run a little counter to what some of the doctors thought was happening in the moment.
Such as?
I think that some of perhaps his conversations with some of the mayors or governors regarding closing of establishments, whether it was bars, whether it was schools, whatever the situation might have been, that some of those conversations may have run counter to some of the conversations that they were having privately in the White House. And I want to be clear, I was not privy to those conversations in the White House. It was a very small, tight knit group, and that group, to great extent, they almost became like in a bubble. I think during the response, and so they were so burdened with the responsibilities of combating the disease, coming up with recommendations and guidance for the public, for business, for education. It was a heady responsibility at the time.
I know, they say hindsight is 2020, and it's very easy to say now, or easier to say now, what could have or should have been done. Kind of putting yourself back in the shoes of the 2020, 2021 era, were the decisions, those closures that you talked about between schools and restaurants, were they correct decisions, or were they in some form decisions made based on the correct, like they got to those decisions by going through the processes correctly? Like, how would you assess the decisions that were made based on what you and your team and Dr. Fauci knew in the moment?
So I think it's really important to note that during this pandemic, the decision tree and how decisions were made around this outbreak were different than how they're typically made. And so typically in an outbreak like Ebola, SARS, MERS, even the vaping epidemic when I was at CDC, CDC is the tip of the spear. They stand up an operations center. All of the relevant expertise and experts are situated within that response. And there's a clear vetting of guidance. It's important to know that CDC doesn't issue, mandatory decisions. They provide guidance. They provide data that informs policy decisions. And so typically those decisions or those guidance or the data would be evaluated within the response, and recommendations would be elevated, by which then the director would approve or disapprove or modify the course of action. In the case of COVID, which was the first pandemic in over 100 years, so nobody working in federal government, no matter their standing or their tenure, for existence, Dr. Fauci had been in the federal government for 40 years, hadn't encountered a pandemic. And so the architecture of the response changed quite a bit. At first, there was responsibility taken on by HHS over all of the public health agencies. And then it was eventually elevated to a federal level when the president declared a national emergency. And FEMA took on some responsibilities, and the White House took on some responsibilities. There was confusion, and there was a lot of input around developing guidance. And though the task force was the nexus for that decision making, it was different than it is in a typical response. And so one of the things that was important about this hearing on Monday is that we do need to understand the root cause of the outbreak. What caused COVID? How did it spread? But we also have to go back and do an autopsy on how the COVID response was handled. That's the second and critical point, because we will have another pandemic. And if it is a national emergency, we do not want to replicate the same mistakes. And mistakes were made.
What do you think those mistakes were? And let me just, admit, it must have been horrifying for everybody in public health, because you didn't know what you were dealing with. It evolved, and as a result, the response evolved along with it. But back to the other question, what did we miss?
Yeah, I think, I'm a communicator, so I'm going to speak to it through this framework. And that was my core responsibility during the pandemic. There are best practices during any kind of crisis situation or emergency response, in particular, a public health response. And that apparatus got very confused, chaotic. And actually, when I left CDC, I saw it from the outside more clearly than I could even see it from the inside. And we did not have throughout the pandemic clear, concise, consistent messaging coming from credible, trusted sources at all times. So there began to be this deterioration, perhaps of trust, of empathy for what Americans were going through, being on lockdown. There was a detachment between what was happening in Washington and what was happening in the normal everyday lives of American citizens and people around the world for that matter. And so communication and how we do that into the future is critical to public health. It's critical today. It's always critical. As we look at some of the outbreaks and foodborne illnesses that are spreading today, there's virtual silence coming from CDC. That's not good, because when there's silence, then you see a pervasive amount of misinformation.
I'm wondering, I want to circle back to the hearing with Dr. Fauci. Do you think that his decision to plead the fifth all those times, do you think based on what he outlined for his reasons, do you think it was the right decision?
You know, I can't say right or wrong for Dr. Fauci. I will say that I think there's an ongoing antagonistic relationship between Senator Paul and Dr. Fauci. And I think that the just the general tenor of conversation has grown more antagonistic between them. It's somewhat personal. And in my opinion, it's unproductive. And so I really do hope that there is a point in time and some context and forum where Dr. Fauci is able to speak to the issues that are of concern to Senator Paul and to others, not only on the committee, but in the general public. And how that takes shape, I don't know. But I hope it's in an environment where it's not politically so unpalatable, and where it serves the best interests of American citizens. Because we do have to hear from Dr. Fauci, and seeing his diaries, we do need to have him square what he said publicly and what he said privately.
Let me ask you this, because Senator Paul wants to hold him in contempt of Congress. In Florida, the Attorney General has opened an investigation to question what he knew during the pandemic and whether he misled the public. The Lieutenant Governor of Florida backs the probe, and he's framing it as a push for accountability over the restrictions. Is this perhaps the wrong tack to take, in that during the pandemic, we as a nation lost so many health professionals, and being in health, no one would have posited this years ago, is now becoming a danger to some people and their families, depending on where they are on that healthcare spectrum. How do you square all of that?
Well, I can't speak to the legal aspects of contempt. I have to kind of leave that to the legal experts. But one of the things that you are pointing up is that one of the lessons learned from COVID is that not all things are the same in all parts of the country. And as the response progressed, different states began to address their response independently and differently. So Florida, for example, wanted to open earlier. Georgia opened earlier. There was consternation and comments from the president about the governor of Georgia opening so early. He was one of the first. Texas opened early and then closed down when they saw a spike in cases again. And then there were other states that really stayed locked down longer. And this is the whole, this goes back to, we have got to have an open dialogue where there isn't the element of punitive threat and whatever that threat may look like, because we have to get to the root cause of this. And to continue to litigate or to put up barriers to free and open conversation moves us further from the end goal.
To that point, and we'll wrap here. I think, you mentioned having a forum where there's not this threat against the person testifying or talking about the issues. So let's say we get to that place. There is a forum, there is a place to discuss these ideas without the political or legal threats to it. What would you say is the thing that we have learned? Do you think our country is better prepared now than it was, a handful of years ago if something like a COVID pandemic were to happen again?
We are not better, unfortunately, than we were going into COVID. Going into COVID, we knew very well what our deficits were in the public health system. Those working across the country in public health knew what the deficits were. And some of those were, a lack of resources, both financial and in talent and personnel, laboratory capacity, state of the art data systems, and of course, a communications infrastructure across the country so that when things like this happen, people who are able to professional health communicators are able to get the word out in a timely, reasonable, and informed fashion to those who are going to be impacted. There's a lot of lessons. So we've also seen, particularly with CDC and across the HHS family, a reduction in force that came through the DOGE situation. We saw after COVID, specifically, and at the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, a lot of very senior expert professional public health folks had left the CDC. They just had reached their retirement term and they were ready to go. So that's a lot of institutional knowledge, both through attrition and through the DOGE cuts that have depleted CDC and the public health infrastructure across the country. We have to be more serious. Congress has to be more serious about funding public health because public health is a critical component of our national security. If we are not a well nation, if we cannot address disease outbreaks at their source, then we are vulnerable. And in an era where biotechnology and biomedical science is advancing so quickly and our adversaries are gaining on us, it's imperative that our public health institutions are fully formed and ready for the next response.
All right, former CDC Senior Advisor Loretta Lepore, really grateful for your time and insight today. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.